Cuba is on the brink of collapse. Once a symbol of resistance and revolution, the nation now faces a devastating crisis. The Cuban people struggle daily with food shortages, endless blackouts, and relentless political repression. This video delves into the heart of the Cuban crisis, exploring the causes and impacts of this looming catastrophe. Cuba is an island located in the Caribbean, known for its rich history and vibrant culture. With a population of approximately 11 million people, the official language is Spanish. Geopolitically, Cuba has historically allied with countries such as Russia and China, while maintaining a tense relationship with the United States due to the long-standing economic embargo. Cuba's geographic proximity and strategic importance in the Caribbean make it a focal point of international interest. Currently, Cuba faces a series of critical problems. The economic crisis is exacerbated by the US embargo and ineffective internal policies. The population suffers from food shortages, lack of medicines, and frequent blackouts. Additionally, political repression stifles free expression and protest, creating an environment of fear and insecurity. These combined challenges have led to growing social discontent and a significant increase in emigration, as Cubans seek better living conditions elsewhere. To understand the depth of the current crisis, it is essential to revisit Cuba's recent history and how its political and economic decisions have shaped the present situation. Since the Cuban Revolution in 1959, led by Fidel Castro, Cuba has adopted a socialist economic model, heavily reliant on the Soviet Union until its collapse in 1991. The post-Soviet period, known as the Special Period, was marked by extreme shortages and economic hardships, forcing Cuba to seek new forms of economic sustenance and to open certain areas to foreign investment and tourism. During the 2000s, the Cuban government initiated a series of economic reforms aimed at revitalizing the economy. Under the leadership of Raúl Castro, there was a modest opening for the private sector and increased trade relations with countries like Venezuela and China. However, these reforms were often slow and insufficient to address the deep structural issues within the Cuban economy. The period of rapprochement with the United States during Barack Obama's presidency brought brief relief, but this was quickly reversed under the Trump administration, which intensified sanctions. The COVID-19 pandemic introduced new challenges, exacerbating the already precarious economic situation. The collapse of tourism, a key revenue source, led to a significant loss of foreign currency. Measures to control the pandemic, including border closures and lockdowns, worsened resource and food shortages, leading to a significant increase in public dissatisfaction. Given this scenario, how has the Cuban government addressed the growing demands for change and freedom? Political repression is a hallmark of the Cuban regime under the leadership of Miguel Díaz-Canel. The government controls nearly all media and severely restricts access to external information, censoring critics and independent journalists. Freedom of expression is extremely limited, and those who dare to challenge the status quo face persecution and imprisonment. This repressive environment prevents any form of organized opposition, making it difficult to mobilize for significant reforms. Political imprisonment is a constant reality in Cuba. Currently, the country holds over 1,000 political prisoners, including prominent activists who have been convicted of crimes that are essentially acts of political dissent. These arbitrary imprisonments not only intimidate government critics, but also silence important voices that could contribute to a national debate on necessary reforms. Notable cases such as that of José Daniel Ferrer and other opposition leaders illustrate the harshness with which the Díaz-Canel regime treats any form of resistance. In addition to internal repression, the government of Miguel Díaz-Canel also faces significant external pressures. The economic sanctions imposed by the United States, which have been reinforced in recent years, have a devastating impact on the economy and the government's ability to provide basic services to the population. However, these external difficulties are often used by the government as a justification to further suppress internal dissent, perpetuating a cycle of authoritarianism and poverty. With political repression so deeply entrenched, how do the Cuban people cope with daily social challenges? Living conditions in Cuba have rapidly deteriorated in recent years. Food shortages are a severe issue, with basic items like milk, bread and cooking oil frequently unavailable. This is due to a combination of ineffective agricultural policies and difficulties in importing essential goods due to a lack of foreign currency. Recently, the Cuban government requested food aid from the UN World Food Programme, something that had previously only occurred in the aftermath of natural disasters. Electricity blackouts are a daily reality for many Cubans. The country's energy infrastructure is in ruins, with frequent failures leading to prolonged power outages. This not only affects domestic life, but also economic productivity and the functioning of essential services like hospitals and schools. The lack of fuel and maintenance issues are significant factors contributing to this energy crisis. The healthcare system, once a national pride, is collapsing. The lack of medicines and medical supplies has severely impacted the quality of care. Diseases that were previously treatable now pose greater threats due to the shortage of basic resources. Additionally, rising infant mortality rates and decreasing life expectancy are clear indicators of the devastating impact of the government's economic and social policies. With social problems accumulating, connectivity becomes essential. However, access to the internet in Cuba faces significant challenges that reflect these difficulties. Internet access in Cuba is limited and tightly controlled by the government of Miguel Díaz-Canel. The country's internet infrastructure has slowly expanded, but access remains restricted for most Cubans. The internet is primarily provided through public Wi-Fi hotspots and some domestic services, but these are expensive and inaccessible to many due to the country's low average wages. Additionally, the Cuban government exercises strict control over the internet, censoring content critical of the regime and restricting access to independent and international websites. Censorship is enforced through website blockages and monitoring of citizens' online activities. Independent journalists and bloggers who publish content critical of the government often face reprisals, including detentions and intimidation. While the government has expanded internet access in recent years, there remains a significant divide between urban and rural areas. The high costs of access make the internet a luxury that many Cubans cannot afford regularly. Despite these limitations, the internet has become an important tool for activists and ordinary citizens, enabling communication and the dissemination of information about the country's situation, albeit with many risks involved. But what do you have to say about this? Do you think it's fair for the government to control the internet for its own interests? In your opinion, would making the internet free in Cuba result in widespread chaos in the country? Tell us in the comments. I would love to know your thoughts on this. With the internet being a crucial but limited and controlled resource, how is the Cuban economy coping with these and other pressures? The Cuban economy faces monumental challenges that further exacerbate the social and political crisis. Uncontrolled inflation is one of the biggest concerns. Monetary reforms implemented in 2021, which included the devaluation of the Cuban peso, aimed to stabilize the economy, but resulted in a dramatic increase in prices and a decline in real incomes. The government's inability to control inflation has led to a significant rise in the cost of living, exacerbating poverty and food insecurity. The COVID-19 pandemic worsened the economic situation. Tourism, one of the country's main sources of revenue, was severely affected, leading to a significant loss of foreign currency. This decline in tourism impacted not only the economy in general, but also local industries that depend on tourists to sustain their operations. Additionally, the pandemic forced the government to redirect limited resources to respond to the health crisis, leaving other critical areas even more neglected. Another major problem is Cuba's external debt. Despite several renegotiations, debt pressure remains a significant factor hindering economic recovery. The lack of foreign investment, due both to the US embargo and to the lack of confidence in Cuba's economic and political stability, further aggravates the situation. The centralized and inefficient economic model, characterized by a large number of unproductive state-owned enterprises, contributes to low efficiency and stagnant economic growth. With so many challenges ahead, what are the prospects for Cuba's future? What can be done to alleviate this deep crisis and bring hope to the Cuban people? The future of Cuba depends on a series of complex and interconnected factors. The first issue to consider is the need for deep economic reforms. The government of Miguel Diaz-Canel needs to implement significant structural changes to stimulate productivity, attract foreign investments, and diversify the economy. This includes the liberalisation of the private sector and the creation of a more business-friendly environment, something that has been done slowly and inconsistently so far. Another crucial aspect is the impact of the United States economic sanctions. While sanctions are often justified as a way to pressure the Cuban government to improve human rights and open its political system, they have also contributed to the suffering of the Cuban people by limiting access to essential resources and strangling the economy. There is a growing debate about whether these sanctions are doing more harm than good, with many arguing that ending the embargo could facilitate economic recovery and improve living conditions in Cuba. However, it is important to recognise that the Cuban Communist government also bears significant responsibility for the current situation. The lack of effective political and economic reforms, combined with corruption and administrative inefficiency, has perpetuated a cycle of poverty and repression. The concentration of power and repression of dissent hinder any significant and sustainable progress. Therefore, for Cuba to truly advance, there must be a genuine commitment to democratic and economic changes from its leaders. The role of the international community is vital for Cuba's future. In addition to the possible lifting of US sanctions, support from other nations in terms of investments and humanitarian aid can help alleviate the crisis. International organisations and allied countries could play a crucial role in providing the necessary resources to help Cuba overcome its economic and social difficulties. Finally, Cuba's future will also depend on the resilience and spirit of its people. Cubans have shown a remarkable ability to resist and adapt to adversity over the decades. If there is political openness that allows for greater civil society participation and the implementation of effective economic reforms, there is hope that Cuba can chart a path towards a more prosperous and free future. Cuba is at a critical crossroads, facing a devastating combination of economic, social, and political challenges. Internal repression, the communist regime, economic difficulties exacerbated by US sanctions, and inadequate internet access are just some of the barriers the country faces. For Cuba to emerge from this crisis, there must be a genuine commitment to political and economic reforms from both the government of Miguel Diaz-Canel and the international community. The easing of sanctions, along with international support in terms of investments and humanitarian aid, could provide a viable path for recovery and improve living conditions for the Cuban people. However, true change must come from within. The Cuban government needs to recognise and act upon the urgent needs of its people by implementing reforms that promote economic and political freedom. The resilience and determination of the Cuban people will be crucial in this process. With a comprehensive and collaborative approach, there is hope that Cuba can overcome its current challenges and build a more prosperous and free future. What do you think about the crisis in Cuba? Do you believe international intervention is necessary, or should the solution come from within the country? Leave your comments below and let us know what other topics you would like to see covered. Don't forget to like this video if you found it valuable, and subscribe to the What is Happening channel for more in-depth analyses of global issues. See you in the next video.